If you are a classical player and are looking for a high quality opening, the classical variation of the Slav defense could be something for you. It is a solid but by no means boring weapon against first d4. In many lines, there are enough imbalances upon which black can build winning ideas. In my opinion, the Slav and the Queen's Gambit declined are more or less equivalent openings, with their specific pros and cons. I see the Slav benefiting from the fact that it avoids the Catalan and the exchange variation of the Queen's Gambit declined. And against the English or Reti type setups, life appears to be somewhat easier. Now let's dive into the specifics. d4, d5, c4, c6, knight f3. That is the main move. There are alternatives such as c takes d5, the exchange variation. It is not without poison to play c takes d5, but if black knows what he is doing, he can equalize. Knight f6. Let's go one move back. Thinking about the Slav, you should consider it a system with more or less 4 modules. Module number 1 deserves some mentioning here. You can also play the move e6, which after knight c3, d takes c4 is a notable variation. I am not a big fan of the notable. I think it's slightly better for white, but of course it is playable. The main move is knight f6, however. And now white has a wider range of options. The big main line is knight c3. Alternatively, there is a huge array of possibilities such as e3, that is the most important of the sidelines, but it cannot really endanger our Slav defense a lot. Then there is queen c2. Beside that we have knight bd2. And then we should also mention the move g3. And finally queen to b3. But the only really critical move here is knight c3. And now it is black's choice again. Here there are 3 modules available, the remaining 3 of the 4 modules in total. For instance, there is a move a6 called the Chebanenko variation. I don't like it very much. I think after c5 white is slightly better, but it is playable. Then we have e6, which is a very nice alternative to our classical variation. This is a famous semi-Slav, and it is more complicated and more competitive than d takes c4. But yeah, you have to learn quite a lot of theory. I would say if you are new to the Slav, there are some arguments for beginning with the classical line, which is our topic, d takes c4. And maybe once you master the classical line, you can then complement it with the semi-Slav. Then you are not that calculable as a player. You can vary according to your opponent or the tournament situation. You are more flexible if you can play both lines. I want also to mention that in the perfect world we could simply play bishop f5. followed by e6 and equalize, but sometimes the world isn't perfect. This move, bishop f5, is a mistake. There are two good lines for white. C takes d5. If black recaptures with a knight, you see the drawback immediately. Black loses the grip in the center, and after queen b3, white is clearly better. e4 is maybe coming somewhere in the future. So let's go back to c takes d5, c takes d, the normal move, but now after queen b3 we see the drawback of the premature move bishop f5. In many queen pawn openings, the problem of an early bishop f5 is the weakness of the pawn b7. And now after queen b6, knight takes d5 is winning a pawn, so the best black can do is to return to the bishop, maybe hoping that this symmetrical structure is kind of saving him from being a lot worse due to the loss of time. But after bishop g5, white's position can be considered clearly better. The other line white could play after bishop f5 is queen b3, again attacking the b7 spot, queen b6, and now the typical move c5. You can, maybe you know this with colors reversed, so the anti-London system is very similar. There black plays queen b6, and after queen b3 pushes the pawn to c4. Let's say queen takes b3, ab3, and now one of black's problems is that he cannot really prevent white from pushing his doubled b pawn to b5. For instance, knight bd7, b4, a6, but as the a pawn is pinned, white can play b5 anyways, takes, rook c8. The knight returns, and now we can take stock. The pawn c5 here is very annoying for black, as you can see, because it hinders the development specifically of the bishop. Also, the knight d7 is restricted, so white is clearly better here. The c5 pawn is just much more valuable than the pawn on a6. Now let's go back to this junction here. On move 4 we play d takes c4. Giving up the center appears to be a bit counterintuitive, but it is a necessary preparation for bishop f5. Now the threat is to safeguard our loot, the pawn c4, with b5. So white normally plays a4. There are also other moves. For instance, could white play e4, the Tolush-Geller gambit, but now after b5 white has to play for equality. Then there also is the Alekhine variation e3, but after b5, a4, b4, and now either knight a2 or knight b1. In both ways, black has quite an easy game, easy equality, and sometimes even white has to be a bit careful. So this is equal here. Only move if white really wants to play for an opening advantage is the move a4, preventing b5. And now we can finally develop our queen's bishop to f5. Now there are two moves basically. The move e3, this is still the main line. e3, it is the most frequent move. here, this is what we are dealing with today. The alternative is knight e5. It's a bit more ambitious, but if black knows the theory, knows what's going on in this position, he is also doing fine. But it is a bit more demanding. Play will become a bit more concrete compared to e3. However, if you play on a level 2200 and below, and this is mostly the case if you blitz on the internet, you will mostly encounter the move e3. White wants to recapture the pawn c4 with the bishop, of course. So e6 is what black is doing. Bishop takes c4, bishop b4. I think this is a very good time to take stock, to conduct positional analysis. If you want to evaluate a position, you have to conduct a positional analysis. So positional analysis does not mean analyzing the position in the traditional way, because that also involves concrete variations. It is more like taking apart the position, or breaking down the position into its parts, into its elements, positional elements. Now, if it comes to the positional elements, what can we list here in white's favor? White has space advantage, because white has, of course, pawn on d4, pawn on the fourth rank, while black does not have the same. Also, white has two center pawns. Black only has one center pawn. Definitely that is in white's favor. And also white could possibly increase his space advantage by pushing the pawn to e4. Then this bishop on f5 here is a bit exposed. There are ideas such as knight h4, going for the bishop, or should the bishop move to g6, which we will be seeing in our game. White could play knight e5 takes g6, so white could go for the bishop pair. This is quite a lot in white's favor, but black also has a lot of things going for him. First of all, black can freely develop all his minor pieces, because the square e4 for now is under black's control, as you can see. So all pieces, including the problem bishop on f5, I mean, in many queen pawn openings, the c8 bishop, the light squared bishop, is a problem piece, but this problem piece could be deployed to f5 and is outside of the pawn formation, right? So playing e4 is not that easy for white. So black has a free piece development. Then the second square black owns right now is the square b4, where our bishop here has a very nice outpost. And in the same context, the square a5 also belongs to black, and this means that the queen could go later to a5 in many lines. Imagine the pawn would still stand on a2. Then of course b4 would not be an outpost. White could play a3 and later b4. So both squares b4 and a5 would not be in black's hands. If one square is weakened, in this case the square b5, this also means that other squares are weakened. That's why we are all mostly or very often talking about weak color complexes. Okay, we have these squares, that is fine. Then black can later play moves such as c6, e5 and also e6, e5. These are the typical pawn thrusts or levers black has available. So black can challenge white's space advantage should black manage to place either pawn push. Black has enough space for his pieces. So we see black has a lot of going for him. Now let's continue with our game. Castle, castle, queen e2. Not the only move, but the normal move. White now is actually threatening to play e4. For instance, if black plays knight bd7, and this move actually was played more frequently than our move bishop g6. So in case of knight bd7, white can push his pawn, and now black cannot take on c3 in order to win the pawn on e4 because of this move, e takes f5, finally winning a pawn on e6 and winning the game. Or let's say achieving a one position, which is not the same as winning the game, as we all know. So black after e4 would have to remove his bishop to g6, and after bishop d3, white is slightly better. There is no doubt about it. White has the perfect pawn center, but still black has enough space for feeling okay. But this is not enough, in my opinion. If I play an opening, I don't want to concede a stable slight advantage to my opponent. So my entire opening repertoire is of high quality lines, so I normally achieve equality or near equality in what I play. For this reason, I recommend you to play bishop g6, exclamation mark. This move can be called prophylaxis because now white cannot play e4. After e4 you just take, and I think now you take with a knight, attacking another pawn. You are up a pawn. White has a bit of space advantage still and the two bishops, but that's not enough compensation. I think black is clearly better here. For that reason, white has to be more restrained. Now the main move is knight e5. We play knight bd7, developing our last minor piece. And now white takes the bishop. hg6. Now there's another good moment to take stock because something has changed. Whenever there is an alteration of material or the pawn structure, it is time to re-evaluate. So white does have won the bishop pair, which is by itself an asset. But the question is this really helping him a lot? Now white still has space advantage, and now also the two bishop. Does white have an overall positional advantage? The answer is no. Why is that the case? For once, the bishop c1 is quite passively placed right now because it is boxed in here. You see the pawn chain, f2, e3, d4. And yeah, I forgot to mention that earlier when taking stock for the first time. So one benefit of black setup is that the bishop is not outside of the pawn chain. So this bishop is not really much better than a knight here right now. Then we have the weak squares, and it's actually not only b4, it's also the square b3. And then we also have and this can be relevant in an endgame, the two pawns here, b2, a4, they are artificially separated. All of you know about isolated pawns. These pawns are in many positions or variations artificially isolated, because not always can the a4 pawn be defended by b3 later if black controls the square. So the a4 pawn is very exposed. So then there is something more to say, but I will just do it 2 moves later down the road. So now white plays rook d1. White cannot play e4 right now, because after knight b6, black is actually attacking 2 pawns at once. The pawn d4 is attacked. Okay, now the arrow is working. And the pawn e4 is also under attack. For instance, if white defends the e-pawn, okay, now it works. We take, and lo and behold, we can win the e4 pawn as the queen is overloaded. In this position, black would be winning. Okay, that's why white has to prepare e4 by first overprotecting the d4 pawn. Now we play queen a5, and I mentioned that earlier. a5 is just a perfect square for our queen. Now white plays e4, otherwise the bishop d2 would have to face a very, very bad fate. So e4, I mean bishop d2 also does exist as a line, but it's a very easy equality for black. Sometimes then the knight moves away, and then there's a exchange of bishops on d2, when white would just lose his bishop pair. So of course now the bishop is supposed to move to f4, e3 sometimes. Yeah? And now what is black playing? White achieved his ideal pawn center. Black pushes his e-pawn, because we cannot let white have too much space advantage. So this e5 push is, in the Slav defense, in our classical variation, as important as the advanced c6, c5. I don't know the ratio, but maybe both moves occur the same often. Now, this position is a good example for giving you an idea how to combat the bishop pair. Mastering the bishop pair as the bishop pair wielder, but also having the right strategies in place when fighting against the bishop pair strongly adds up to your chess strengths, because the bishop pair, of course, occurs very often in many different chess openings. Now, there are some basic strategies to fight the bishop pair. Strategy 1 is to exchange one of the bishops, so destroy the bishop pair. That's good if you can achieve it, but not always is this possible, because the bishop pair holder will try to avoid just that. Okay, what are you doing then? You should then play on the squares, on the color of squares where you have the superiority. So white is of course superior on the light squares because here white has the light squared bishop. But on the dark squares, you are superior. You have one dark square minor piece more than white. So you should try to play around this light square bishop. And that is what black is doing now. So by playing e5, black will remove the d4 pawn, weakening white on the dark squares. Now there are many moves. We are following the most ambitious one, knight a2. But let's also have a look at what would happen after d5. God, this is very critical move. Just pushing the pawn to d5 looks very aggressive. We play rook a8, and that is very important. What you should not do is to take on d5. If you would take on d5, knight takes d5, the square d5 now is under white's control and will serve the bishop. Right now there's a knight, but this can be exchanged. But then the bishop can be placed there on d5 or the rook. So this square d5 is quite useful for white. White has an advantage in this structure because of the bishop pair and the pressure on the light squares. Also the square f7 is quite weak because the c4 bishop pardon me, would be quite powerful. No, we don't take on d5. We play rook a8, and now we might be taking the knight 4 more later to win a pawn. Also, we can move our knight to c5, adding pressure to the e4 pawn. So white has not that many options here. Taking on c6 is one. And now this structure here is very interesting. I think I mentioned it earlier in my videos because this is just the core of chess strategy. You should think in terms of structures. When learning an opening, try to be conscious about what structures occur, what are the main structures, but also what are the substructures, the sub-substructures, and sometimes even sub-sub-sub, or even one sub more, substructures. So you can go down on different levels. So this is a very important substructure here for our line. At first glance, you could think that the c6 pawn is weak, it's isolated, that is true. The a7 is also isolated. Are these pawns very severe weaknesses? I don't think so, because it is just very difficult for white to get at them. So in chess, everything is relative, and sometimes a weakness is only a weakness in theory but not in practice, as it is not possible for the opponent to exploit them. The pawn c6 actually is the most important player here on the playing field. This is the core player. I mean, the pawn is only a pawn and not a minor piece, but in terms of relative value, I mean, the pawn here, I think, is the piece on the board with the highest relative value, because it is so important for black's position. This pawn single-handedly dominates both of white's minor pieces because the squares b5 and d5 are deprived. Especially the knight c3 looks quite awkward there on this square because it cannot go anywhere. But also the bishop is kept at bay. When playing openings, a very good general strategy is to pay attention to the law of completion. Well, this is actually a term I coined for myself. Maybe it does exist in chess. I don't know. So I coined it for myself for my chess lessons when I give lessons to my students. So the law of completion is that the pieces and the pawns, they should complete each other. You see black is doing very well on the dark squares with all his pieces here on the dark squares. For instance, these pieces. So this pawn c6 is now very vital to control the light squares. That's why this pawn is the most important player here. Okay, so the position is equal. Black has some weaknesses, but white also, and white has restricted minor pieces. Also, don't forget that along the b file, now as the pawn went from b7 to c6, there is some potential pressure, and the pawn b2 is a backward pawn. So the b2 pawn is by no means better than the c6. But the c6 pawn is actually not a liability, it is an asset. Okay, now let's go back to the position after e5. Let's go back to our game, and in this game, white played the most ambitious move, knight a2. So I was talking about that we more or less own the square b4, but also there is a bit of relativity to that. So white can try to fight the square b4 or for the square b4 by moving the knight to a2. But, well, most of the time it's not a big deal because if the bishop just leaves the place, then it is true it has been driven away from b4, but the knight on a2 is misplaced. Sometimes white can play like this and maybe push b4 afterwards. It always depends on the specifics of the position. So in this position, black could take the pawn. I analyzed this position, and this is one possibility, but of course black should make sure not to lose his queen. So there are some forced lines after that. You can do it, but you have to know what you are doing. Safer is to remove the bishop to e7. That's what happened in this game. Now bishop d2 is our move, but let's first have a look at a little fragment here from a game Varganyan-Kobalya, played in Frankfurt 1999. Varganyan, a strong player, normally just made a mistake here by taking on e5. It's not advisable to activate black's knight. So knight takes e5, bishop b3, rook a8, bishop f4. And now I propose a novelty, knight f2 d7. In the game, Kobalya played knight h5. And now let's say bishop c2. So white is maybe hoping to play b2, b4 at one moment. Black plays g5. And now think a bit, how would you evaluate this position? Think for a while. You can press on stop now. So this position here actually is slightly better for black. Move g5 is very important because black is safeguarding his knight e5. There will not be f2, f4. White, of course, would like in a perfect world to play f4 and later e5, reviving the c2 bishop and gaining space. But now you can see that the squares e4, e5 and f4 are owned by black. And this is a good example for the dark squared strategy Black is embarking on in this variation. I told you, if you play against a bishop pair, play on the opposite color of the solitaire bishop. I call the bishop without a counterpart the solitaire. I just don't know the official name, if this name does exist. I call this bishop the solitaire, French word. So he is a sole ruler of the light squares. But the problem is that the solitaire is blind on one eye, can only see half of the chessboard, poor little guy. And so we play on the dark squares. And black actually is slightly better here, despite the fact that white has the two bishops. Coming back to the position after bishop e7. So taking on e5 was not a good idea. In our main game, bishop d2 happened. Now the queen should not be too greedy, because it would be gone after knight b4. That's one way to lose the queen. Now we move the queen to c7, of course. And now white should have played d5 with equality. But in the game, bishop c3 happened. Takes, knight e5. This is a fantastic square for our knight. Obviously, black already has the initiative here. White has to play for equality. In the game, white played bishop b3. Let's have a look at the superior knight c3. The knight returns from the dead. Re-centralizing the knight is a good idea. Rook a8. And actually the threat would now be to take on d4. How can I show it to you? Let's make a zero move. Let's make a zero move. Rook b1. Our zero move. And now this one would happen. Takes. Bishop c5. Pardon me, this was a mouse slip. Once again. Rook d2, and now knight f to g4. And yes, don't play rook f1 now. After rook f1, we have a nice finish here, right? Checkmate. So black is all about the dark squares here on this line. So nice. This line is a nice example for dark squared strategy. Very tricky, right? So that is the threat. So I think g3 now is the best white can play, blunting the queen on the b8 h2 diagonal. Now we play, nevertheless, knight fg4. Now again threatening to take here, followed by bishop c5. Quite impressive motives. For instance, h3 question mark, rook takes d4, takes bishop c5. Well, you have to take here. Wait a second, I have another line. What is the other line? Rook 81. Yeah, this is another line. I also want to show it to you. After rook 81, defending the rook, we take on f2. These are tactics you normally see in the King's Indian or in other very tricky openings. You wouldn't necessarily expect them happening in the solid classical Slav. But I told you already in the header, the classical Slav is not without poison. For instance, queen takes c4, knight c4, and of course we will be grabbing the exchange on d4 and ending up with an extra pawn. or if not queen takes, but king takes, f2. Now we are enhancing the pressure here, and we still have one rook more to bear on the square d4. So black is winning. Coming back to bishop c5, let's see this move, h takes g4. Bishop takes d4, rook d1, bishop b6, king. The king goes away from the diagonal, intending f4. If this would be happening, white would be doing okay, but now we play the strong move g5, and now f4 is prevented, because see for yourself, after f4, gf4, gf4, knight f6, white would be collapsing on the dark squares. This f4 square is not to be defended anymore. Yes, after g5, actually black is clearly better. Look at the pieces. We see a nice complementary situation. The pawn c6, our best player here, blunting white's minor pieces, but our minor pieces are extremely strong, and of course then white also has just the worst pawn majority. White's pawn majority with the double pawns here is not as mobile, and you know the king here needs some protection, so you cannot really move the f-pawn. So it's kind of a paralyzed pawn majority, while black's pawn majority can be used later on, maybe a takes b5, and maybe black can later in the game also create a passed pawn on the queen side. But I see black rather try to win here in a different way. I guess the idea here, in order to win the game, is to exchange rooks. And after the rooks are exchanged, you will then enter the position with the queen. You will try to enter the position somewhere in the dark squares, and then we will have so many weaknesses. f2, e4, b2, a4, and these soft spots can be attacked. I mean, if you have one or two soft spots, normally you can easily defend them, but if there are too many of them, the defenses are often overstrained in their task to defend all of them at once. So this would be the idea for black to win this position. Okay, now let's go back to our game. After knight e5, so knight c3. But okay, no, let me just, before I do that, for the sake of completeness, show you one more line, because I gave you the impression that black is already clearly better here, but that's not the case. So let's go one more time back to the better move, knight c3. In the game we will be discussing in a bit the move bishop b3. So after knight c3, rook a8, g3, knight fg4, we just saw the move h3 being answered by rook takes d4 exclamation mark. Here white has something better. White must now take on e5, giving up his important dark square bishop, but the tactical threat of rook takes d4 was just too strong. Knight takes e5. If white now is sleeping by playing, let's say, bishop a2, again our key move g5 would give black the clearly better position, because the knight e5 is stabilized. We can also think in terms of maybe later play g4 if this is not prevented by h3. But this knight is a monster. Also our e7 bishop is extremely strong, while white's minor pieces are quite insipid. So h4, very important move, the only move here actually for white, in order to prevent g5. So now maybe the best move is knight takes c4, queen takes c4, queen c8, and the position is roughly equal, but I think black is sitting on the better end of equality because black has some more active plans. Pardon me, I wanted to draw an arrow. Bishop f6, rook fe8, and also move like queen g4, and yeah, you have this pawn e4 a bit exposed, right? So white has to be more careful than black here. Okay, now finally we come back to the position after knight e5, and we see what happened after the bad move bishop b3. Rook 88, and black is already clearly better. If you would now call a person from the street, asking this person, how would you evaluate this position, that person maybe would say, well, white is better, more space, two bishops. Or maybe the person would say roughly equal, yeah. Both sides have their advantages and disadvantages, but actually black is already clearly better. And of course this is also a very positive aspect of the classical Slav, because the advantage sometimes comes under the radar. If you have seen my video on the Caro-Kann, you know what I'm talking about. These camouflaged advantages, which are not visible instantly with the naked eye, are the most dangerous ones. Because if you as a player don't know that you are already in a critical position, of course your attention is strongly reduced and things can get worse very quick. So the threat again is rook takes d4, sacrificing the exchange, and after rook takes d4, then bishop c5, followed by, no, not there, sorry, sometimes my mouse is a bit hyperactive, and again we see the problem of the dark squares white is facing. Now in the game, white played a normal move, h3, preventing this dangerous knight g4 idea. Normal but bad. The best move would have been bishop c3, preventing rook takes d4, obviously. But now the bishop comes to c5. Now knight eg4 is, of course, the threat. g3, blunting the queen on that diagonal. But now the queen, once blunted on one diagonal, just moves to the other one, to the other juicy diagonal. Okay, it's about the point f2, obviously, but also we have some ambitions here on the b file, as you can see. So there are some threats here. Bishop has to take the knight. Now the queen takes this one. Knight c3. Well, that knight has to return. Rook fe8. There's some pressure on the e file. Takes. And of course, black has a clear advantage because we see this pawn exposed. We see also this pawn here under. Why are my keys not really working? These pawns also a bit under pressure. They are artificially separated. And of course also the f2 pawn is a potential target because our bishop is so strong on c5. So white has, or black has a distinct advantage here. Now going back to the game, rook 88. Now in the game we are seeing the move h3. Normal move, but bad. And now we are deviating from the game. The game ended in a draw. Actually, now I don't know what happened in the game, but I don't have it here in my script. I forgot it because I prepared this material long time ago, many months ago. I can only show you what the best move here is, and maybe you want to look for yourself. So press on stop if you have this ambition. Now I'm going to say it. So the very strong move now is rook takes d4, and this move receives 2 exclamation marks. It's an exchange sacrifice, but a more or less a long-term one, and that makes it so interesting. If you sacrifice something and regain the material a couple of moves later by force, more or less, it's not really a sacrifice, right? So this is a real sacrifice. Sacrifice, as I define it, or well, not only me, but many others as well, is like giving up material with a certain amount of risk, because compensation is long term, and that's why it merits here 2 exclamation marks. Rook takes, queen b6, it's a double attack. Again, the bishop and rook, and this can be met by the move queen d1. Actually, at the first glance, everything looks okay for white, and now black plays g5. This position here is, believe it or not, clearly better for black, despite black being down an exchange. The compensation is long term, and it's not only sufficient compensation, but it is a huge overcompensation for the exchange. Now, the knight has to return, can go to c1 or c3. c1 is better, but let's see knight c3 first. Now the threat is a5 in order to expel the queen from this so powerful position here, but we just block it. Black has all the time in the world because his advantage is a long-term one. Rook d2, so the rook is now not threatened by the queen anymore, and also this one is anticipating bishop c5, and also f2 is overprotected, and now g4, and actually black is attacking. So the compensation here is attacking chances. Now, you might know Thal's famous attacking ratio. When evaluating a sacrifice, of course, you should not so much think in absolute material terms, but more in efficiency, so relative value of material. So now we have actually 1, 2, 3, 4, and in a bit you will see why. 5 attackers, but defenders you only have 1, 2, and all the rest is far away. Look also at the minor pieces. This knight is very impotent. It's very impotent. The bishop also. They are just pieces of dead wood. They have no impact on the position whatsoever. And also, the rook a1 is not really participating. So g3 could be an idea, or taking, let's say white plays king h1 in order to prevent g3. Now look what black plays. Black plays simply g6 followed by king g7, and rook h8. That's why I also included the rook in this attacking ratio. So we have actually, let's count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and why not? also count in this pawn here, maybe, if you want. We have many attackers and a lot of bystanders in white's camp. That's why this long-term sacrifice is so incredibly strong and appealing. Now the best line would be knight c1. On c3 the knight is in a misery place, so the knight goes to better squares. And now, of course, again a5 is a threat. That's why we are blocking the pawn. Rook d2, g4. Again, the pawn is the battering ram here. So let's first have a look at h takes g4, knight e4, taking the rook goes away, knight takes g4, f2 is under pressure. At least now the knight comes to a good square, or is at least helping, but that's not enough. We still can just take f2. Takes. And now bishop h4, queen f3, bishop takes f2. You see the queen is overloaded, as a bishop b3 would be hanging after. Queen takes f2. So black is up 2 pawns and has an easy win. That's why after g4 you cannot take the pawn. hg4, knight e4 does not work. Better is queen e2, protecting the e4 pawn. But now we can play g3. Let's say king f1 is the best move. G takes f2. This position is clearly better for black. You see black has very active pieces. White has a lot of soft spots. The pawns are all quite soft, and the bishop here is loose. But most importantly, white has a long-term unsafe king. Such positions are very difficult to play. When your king is unsafe, you have to calculate all these tactics. Very, very bad feeling, right, to play a position with an open king. So yeah, a clear advantage. That's a nice achievement for our opening, right? That's why we can call it a day here. I hope you liked it. And if you want to learn the Slav defense or other openings, visit my website and book some lessons with me. I fully analyze the Slav, not only the classical variation, also the semi-Slav. So if you want to learn the Slav, I could be your man. Have a good day.